Hey, this is Pastor Matt with our second session in our study of the course we're going through, the study guide we're going through, What on Earth Am I Here For? I hope you enjoyed the first study, got a chance to discuss with your small group and whoever you're meeting with some of those questions as we wrapped up session number one on understanding this whole concept of God's purpose and God's call for our life. If you go ahead and turn to session number 2, we're going to jump in and talk about this really how to live out our purpose or find our purpose. And the first purpose we'll find is that of worship. That statement, you were planned for God's pleasure. And so what I'd love for you to do is to go ahead and share an insight maybe that you have had from last week's session and something as you've been kind of processing through. Maybe if you're reading through The Purpose-Driven Life, that book, you can go ahead and share some insight from there. And then go ahead and ask this question. You can go ahead and pause the session here for a moment. When, where, and how do you feel closest to God? So if you see those questions starting off, catching up, go ahead and pause the video and go over those questions. Hey, as we continue on, we have our memory verse for this week, Romans 6:13b. We'll talk about that in the session. But let's go ahead and get started on page 13 of your study guide. And we'll look at this first purpose for our lives, and that is worship, that you were planned for God's pleasure. When it comes to worship, we use this term so much in our church world, if you will. If you grew up in church, we have worship is just one of those things that comes to mind. Now, I grew up in a Methodist denomination, and worship to me was walking into an auditorium or sanctuary, as we called them. So I was a really young kid, and they had the big organ. So there's the music, the sound of the old organ music playing, or maybe church bells. There's a pre-recorded songs, church bells. So our church, it would ring the bell on the hour, and it would play some church songs. Those loud ding dong. That was kind of, maybe I shouldn't quit my day job with the making bell sounds, but I'd play hymns and things like that, and it would kind of ring across the property there at the church and kind of out into the community. The church, the sanctuary itself, had a very distinct smell. It's kind of an older, musty smell, if you will, of the church pews and the wood, and just kind of had that smell of mustiness, if you will. I can think about the pastor that was Pastor Wooters at the time. He would wear a black robe, and he would have a white collar that he would wear. And so I remember he had a mustache and glasses. And so those are all the things that kind of can remember. I remember the fear and anxiety because as a part of our worship service, they would have the kids come up at one point and they would have a reading or tell a story to the kids. And I was always so afraid because I can remember kids walking up the aisle and tripping, or they get to the steps there at the altar and they would trip and fall. And I was so afraid I would trip. And so many times I would just sit there in the pew and just be so anxious and so scared. And the only thing that I really enjoyed about church, I'll be totally honest, I knew that if I could hang in there through a church service at the end, just because of the timing of everything, if I could hang in there, lunch would be right after church and everything would be fine. Then we'd take an afternoon Sunday nap, if you will, and then get ready for school for Monday to start the week. And so for me, church was, as a kid, just a little bit of this anxiety filled experience, and worship, if you will, was just this very intangible, something that I couldn't really wrap my mind around. It was just something we did. And so for you, for whatever church tradition you come out of, maybe you didn't grow up in church, but for all of us, we have something that comes to mind when we hear the word worship. If you look there, you see Revelation chapter 4, verse 11 says this, that God created all things, and it is for your pleasure that they exist and were created. That God created us because he found pleasure in us. He didn't create us to work for him. God didn't create us to go ahead and be in fear of him. If you look at and study any other religion, or you study some of the mythologies, Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, even Islam, Muslims, they talk about Allah, and there's no really sense of forgiveness. There's just a very strong sense of fear. And that is that the god or gods, whoever they may be, if we make them upset, then they will punish us or rain down catastrophes on us. And so, for many people, their understanding uh, uh, centuries and really millennia ago was that if there's no rain, that means the gods are mad at us. If the crops fail, the gods are mad at us. If a baby dies prematurely, well, the gods were mad at us. If we get a horrible torrential rainstorm or earthquakes, or a home burns down, or a village is overrun by invaders, well, the gods are mad at us. They didn't protect us. And so we smuggle that into our life, and now here in modern day understanding, we think, well, we confuse God and life many times, and we think, well, if bad things happen, then God must be mad at me. We talk about Murphy's Law. We talk about things like, well, if I'm getting punished, that means somebody else somewhere is kind of, they're getting blessing. It's the yin yang kind of Eastern mysticism approach to it. Maybe even like, if you ever notice, by the way, the Pepsi symbol kind of looks like its own variation of the yin yang. We think, well, if I'm being blessed, it means somewhere somebody else is being punished. But worship and pleasing God and what it means to have a relationship with God, it's not that at all in God's mind. Now, the understanding is this, that we are created. When I hear that word created, I think back of creation, that God created. And here's just something interesting to think about. If you take the creation story of each day, of what God created each day, God always created a container, if you will, or a setting or a stage, and then he filled that container or filled that stage. And so we find that God created this, there's this void, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And that he, then the next day, he fills that void, that container, with the sun and the moon, the stars. And then we find that the next day he goes ahead and we find the understanding of there's land that's created, land and sea. And then God fills that land and sea with fish and birds in the sky. And then we have that God creates animals to go ahead and put in that land. And God created a garden, the Bible describes. And before he ever created the sun and the moon, or the fish and the birds, or the animals, or even human beings, he created a place for us so that we could go ahead and have a place to live and inhabit. And so then he placed Adam and Eve in that garden that he created. Why? What was the purpose of all those different things that God did? That strategic planning, that magnificent, a cosmic planning, if you will, of God, his sovereignty. That is God having control. That God did all that because his focus was on you and was on me for his pleasure. Romans 12:1 says, because of God's mercy, his great mercy to us, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice. That word sacrifice is connected with worship, dedicated to his service and pleasing to him. This is the true worship that you should offer. That word worship really can find its roots in worthship, W-O-R-T-H, to ascribe worth or value to something. We ascribe value and worth to all kinds of things. We think of in the terms of, is this worth my time? Or how much are these trading cards worth? I've got a tub, a Rubbermaid tub downstairs in our basement, and my kids came across it one time. My son, he cracked it open, the one in it snapped, and then pulled it open, and it was kind of like that unlocking, like that sound of like a box or container being opened from being in deep cryogenic, storage. And so he opened it up, and you can imagine like the smoke or the dry ice haze rising. And he looks inside, and lo and behold, what did he find? He found a starting lineup of Michael Jordan, and he found a card catalog of all these Michael Jordan cards that I had. And he found these commemorative edition plates that I got, that my parents got for me for Christmas and birthdays, of paintings of Michael Jordan. And so my son said, wow, Dad, you have these in a special place, and why? I said, well, when I was your age, I thought they'd be worth money. And he goes, oh, can I have them? Are they mine? Can I sell them? I said, well, you can try, but they're really not worth anything. Because if you go on eBay nowadays, or you're going on to any kind of card selling or card trading sites or card buying sites for sports card memorabilia, those kind of things, there's so many people that had the same idea that things would be worth a lot of money, value. And what we find is this, that there's this word with worship, there's this understanding of sacrifice. And sacrifice for people back in those days, it was this understanding that when we give something away, we show we give value to the one we worship. And so we let go of, we sacrifice something. And so back in, for the Jews in the Old Testament, they would bring animals, livestock, their best livestock, to the tabernacle or to the temple. And in their system of worship, they would sacrifice those animals. In some cases, they would bring fruit. In some cases, they would bring grain. They would bring wheat sometimes, depending on what was being offered. Sometimes they would bring wine or oil. And so they would bring these things to show worth and to show worship to God. And so it was always the best. And the goal was this, is for maybe forgiveness for sins, or out of a celebration and gratitude to God, a thanksgiving offering of praise, or to commemorate a special festival, a feast time, they would worship as well. So what we find is this, as you look there in your notes, the first couple of blanks is this, that worship is my response to God's love. So we see there Revelation 4:11 talks about that God created us for pleasure. That's why we exist. And the idea of pleasure, you also have the concept of showing love toward somebody or something that brings you pleasure. But then secondly, that worship really is giving back to God. And so that's where the sacrifice aspect comes in. So look at that statement there for us. What do you give to a God who has everything? And God doesn't need anything from us. So what's the answer? Well, we give him the one thing he doesn't have unless you give it to him. And that is this. The one thing that God cannot force us or does not have, he doesn't create us like robots that are programmed to do certain things. He gives us a free will to choose. And that's this. You look there, you give him your love. We find that worship and love, that affection and obsession, all those terminologies that we use to give God our love is a way to worship him. So how do we do that? Mark 12:30 says this, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Giving God the focus with our heart, and trying to dial this down a little bit. Well, what is our heart? Our heart are our passions, our emotions, our kind of our focus of what we kind of have that worry us, that concerns us. And if we're worried, we can't be worshiping. You probably heard me talk about that before, say that. To love God with all your soul. Your soul is that deep inner part of you. The mind is loving God with your thoughts, and your strength, loving God through doing things for God. That we use our hands, what we can do with our hands, that's a way to love God. So loving God with our heart, that would be like our passions. Loving God with all of our soul, that would be the deep contemplations of us. We think about loving God with our mind, that we think about God, and then loving God with our strength, that we actually act it out. And we'll really dial in here as we go through into those four different areas. We look then that worship is an expression of my affection to God. That's what it means. You see, it says down here, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. God wants you to love him passionately. We use those terms in love songs. We talk about the heart and about being heartbroken. We talk about the soul, that we're soul mates. We always use those terms of endearment or terms of affection. If you look on the next page in your books there, it says the first reason God put you on earth was for you to get to know him and to love him back. So the better we get to know God, the better that we can go ahead and love God. Exodus 34:14b. He is a God who is passionate about his relationship with you. So underline that word passionate and underline the word relationship. That God truly wants to have a connection with us. We see in Hosea 6:6, I don't want your sacrifices, I want your love. I don't want your offerings, I want you to know me. It's one thing to go ahead and go to church on a Sunday and we punch our card, if you will, or the time clock, kind of like if you're working a job. You can go ahead and put money in the offering plate. You can say hello to some people. You can stand up and sit down and sing the songs, maybe pray a prayer. But then once we leave there, what does our life look like outside of 1 hour on Sunday morning? And what does life look like? Do we think about God other than just that 1 hour? There's 168 hours in the week. What do you do with the other 167 hours during the week? What we find here is it's this idea of God says, you come to me and you put your time in, but then you never really think about me. It would be the same idea of a husband and wife. where on their 1 year, on their anniversary, once a year, they go out on a date and they get a chance to talk. But then the other 364 days of the year, they don't talk to each other at all until they come back to their anniversary. It's like I've heard before, and you've probably heard me say that a husband, if he says, "Hey, I told my wife that I loved her the day I married her, and if anything changes, well, I'll let her know." And that doesn't go well for a marriage relationship, let alone having a relationship to God. The greatest way to express your love to God is by giving your life to Him. That is by putting your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, and to trust God and put your faith in Him, to believe that there is a God. Romans 6:13b. This is our memory verse. And if you've got the keychain with the key tags, you'll see session 2 has this verse. That God, give yourselves completely to God, since you have been given new life. That is, that we have a response to our Creator. It's this idea that if I took my son out for dinner, and we went go to a restaurant somewhere, and he gets a meal, and I get a meal, and I look at his meal and I say, "Oh, you've got some French fries on your plate there," and I go and take a French fry off his plate, and he says, "Hey, those are my French fries. You can't eat those." Well, what do you think I'm going to be thinking about? What thoughts are going to be running through my mind? I can think, "Listen, man, I'm your dad. I paid for that food. I can take a French fry off of it if I want to. I can take all the French fries. I can take the whole plate if I want to. I'm the one who provided it and paid for it. Who are you to tell me that I can't?" And you understand, what kind of relationship would that be? That wouldn't be a healthy relationship. What kind of relationship would it be if I went to dinner and we didn't talk to each other at all? What kind of relationship would it be if I didn't provide a meal for my son? And what if we didn't have any interaction at all? There would be no relationship. And so we find this, that because God gave us life, then we can, then the natural response is gratitude, to give back to God, to trust God with our lives, to have a relationship with Him, to put our faith and trust in Him, in Jesus Christ, to have a relationship with God. 1 John 4:19, we love Him, why? Because He first loved us. Why do we worship God? Because He loves us. Then we find this, that worship is focusing my attention on God. So we have our affection for God, and whatever we give our affection to has our attention automatically, and vice versa. Whatever has the focus of our attention has the heart of our affection. If you pay attention to stocks, what has your heart? What are you concerned about? What do you worry about? Well, the stock's going up and down. If you've got a piece of property that you own, and you want to keep tabs on it, you keep your home, your property manicured, the lawn manicured and taken care of. If you've got a special car that you purchased and you love that car, what do? You keep it clean and you wax it and you take care of it and make sure nothing gets dirty on it. My wife, her grandfather, for many years, when he would pull his car into his garage, she would tell me that, and I even saw it myself. He had the floor was so clean that you could eat off of it, and he would pull his car into the garage, and he would actually pull his car up onto these little carpet pieces, and then he would wipe down the floor behind where the tire tracks came in so the floor would stay clean, and then he'd make sure there's no oil drips or anything like that. He'd always keep the car tuned up and in good working condition, because that was the focus of his attention, and really that had his affection. We find them, that's what it means to love God, love the Lord your God with all your mind. That is your attention. God wants you to love Him thoughtfully. God wants your focus because He is focused on you and me. Psalm 139, we find this. Go ahead and look there in your notes. We see this. You have looked deep into my heart, Lord, and you know all about me. You know when I am resting. You know when I am working. You notice everything I do and everywhere I go. That God has His focus on us, that God knows these things about us. Colossians 3:2, set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. It's one thing to focus on what's here right in front of us. It's another thing to be looking out, be looking up to the heavens, to focus on things that are above. When we focus on the things that are in the here and now, right before us, it consumes us. We see the bad things that happen, and that's why I talk about doom scrolling, that we scroll through a social media, or we just flip through the channels and we just see one bad thing after another happening. And going through the pandemic time, There was a famous actor, John Krasinski, and he started this YouTube channel called Some Good News Network. And so his goal was to be looking for positive things on social media and positive things that were just happening wherever around the world, around the country, things that were happening that were good. If we look on the next page, when it comes to where we set our attention, we see this: to establish a daily time with God, to get our attention to God. So if you think about it this way, that a permanent condition requires constant supervision. So if we tend to get off focus and we tend to struggle to keep our attention on God, really establishing a daily time with God would be helpful for keeping our focus and our attention. Matthew 6:6, Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount: find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. That is just your pretending. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense His grace. If all we do is go to church on Sunday morning and put our time in and put on our Sunday best and just play a role or play a part, we're just pretending. And I think that's where we run into trouble sometimes, where so much of what the world society sees when they look at worship, they say it's just a joke because it's hypocrisy. It doesn't really matter. And so today, in our day and age especially, authenticity is crucial for credibility. And if you're going to have credibility with your friends and your neighbors and people who don't believe God and don't love God, in order to have an influence and impact, we have to have a credibility and authenticity that what we claim to hold to on Sunday is lived out on our Monday. Well, if you look there, we find this, that it's also not just a daily time with God, but develop constant conversation with God. It's prayer. Worship Him continually, Psalm 105. Isaiah 26:3. You, Lord, will keep in perfect peace all who trust in you, whose thoughts, again, loving God with your mind, are fixed on you. When you fix your thoughts on God, God will fix your thoughts. I love that statement, that when we turn our thoughts to God, that He will help us to have control in our mind. Then we find this last blank for us there on page 15. At worship, it is using my abilities for God. So that's the strength side of things, the strength part. That's what it means to love God with all your strength. God wants you to love Him practically with your actions. So loving God with our heart and soul, that's really having a passion for God, maybe the emotional side of things. It's that of giving our affection to God. Then loving God with our minds, giving Him our attention. And then loving God with our strength, that's giving Him our action, if you will. That's what it means to love God. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as though you were working for the Lord and not for people. Your job when you go in, when you're doing those things, Paul says to us here in Colossians that you have one of two choices. You can focus on one of two bosses, if you will. You can focus on your boss who's sitting in the office and maybe who's not always happy with you, or you can focus on your heavenly boss. You can focus on God and say, you know what, I'm not doing this because I'm getting a paycheck. And it's hard because the daily grind, most people, I just read a statistic, about 50% of people said they're not happy with where they work. Well, if you focus on, well, the boss owes me, or my coworkers, there's just constant conflict and frustration, and maybe it's not a psychologically safe place because you never know. Your boss asks you a question and you don't know if it should be this way or that way. It seems maybe your boss is just contrary to everything you give. No matter what you say, you can't win. And so the encouragement for us is that your work can be worship to God when we do what we do, not because we're trying to please a boss, but because we're trying to please God the best we can. It's not what you do that matters, it's who you do it for, as you see there at the bottom of page 15. Then, Romans 12:1, we'll come back to this. We talked about this verse to start off our discussion this session. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. And so how do we do that? We start off our day thinking about God, processing through. Is God pleased with what I'm doing? Is God pleased with what I'm saying? God, can you help me with my thoughts? We're constantly having God on our mind. And this is what it means to bring God pleasure. This is what it means to take it from just singing on a Sunday morning or saying a prayer in a class for kids in a Sunday school class, or just putting our time in and listening to the pastor preach. This is what it means to really have worship as a part of our life. Real worship is a lifestyle. What is it, a lifestyle? It's that my life is to be a reflection of God's love for me. And as I love God, and as God loves me, and the stronger that gets, then that'll lead me then to my next purpose of how do I live out my life before other people. I can't truly love God the best. I can't love God best I can until I begin to learn how to, all of a sudden, that'll take us to our next purpose, how to love people really well. First John talks about this. John says, a person cannot love God and hate their brother at the same time. Man, that's a tough concept, a tough idea to wrap our minds around. And in the next session, session 3, we're going to really dive into and understand for us how we can live out our next purpose when we love God and how that translates into our earthly relationships. Go ahead and look at your discovery questions then. Go over those with your small group. I'd encourage you to go ahead and take a minute to go through the diving deeper then, and then go ahead and spend some time in prayer. Hey, I love you. I hope that you got encouragement from this session, and we'll look forward to catching up with you in session number 3 as we're going to talk about fellowship, that you are formed for God's family. And we'll talk about how can we love God and really truly love people who sometimes can be a little bit difficult to love. Thanks so much for watching.